It was the coldest winter we had seen in decades. The small town was covered in a thick blanket of snow, and more was falling heavily each night. My family and I were holed up in our little cabin in the woods, the fireplace constantly burning to try to keep the icy chill out. Supplies were running low, as no one had been able to get in or out of town for weeks. One night, during a howling blizzard, there was a frantic knock at our door. I opened it to find our neighbor, Old Man Jennings, covered in snow and shaking uncontrollably. "Let me in, please. There's something out there, something evil," he cried. We ushered the old man inside and got him next to the fire with some hot tea. "What did you see, Mr. Jennings?" my father asked. "I'm not sure," he replied through chattering teeth. Eyes, glowing red eyes peering from the darkness, and howls that didn't sound like any creature I know. It was stalking me through the storm as I ran here. We all felt a creeping dread come over us at the old man's words. My father and brother went to check all the windows and doors while my mother tried to comfort Mr. Jennings. Then we heard the first long, loud wail pierce the night, echoing through the woods right outside the cabin. My skin crawled at the unnatural sound. "My God, what is that thing?" My brother gasped as more hideous wails answered the first. Strange shadows moved outside in the storm, slowly surrounding the small cabin. Mr. Jennings was now rocking back and forth, mumbling incoherently, terror etched on his face. Through the frosty window panes, we could make out massive, hairy forms lumbering through the snow, their eyes burning like hot coals in the darkness. The creatures began slamming themselves against the walls and doors, snarling viciously. Their claws tore at the wood as they tried to break in. My father desperately shoved furniture up to barricade the front door, which was beginning to crack and split under the assault. Howls from the forest and the roof echoed deafeningly around us. The beasts were tearing at the roof now, their claws shredding effortlessly through the shingles. We all huddled together in mute shock and horror beneath the failing shelter. A clawed, hairy arm smashed suddenly down through the weak ceiling boards. My brother screamed as it swiped savagely for our heads. More crashing sounds came from the back of the cabin. My mother wailed, "They're inside." Ravenous, glowing eyes peered through the broken walls, slobber dripping from fang-lined jaws. The monsters descended on us, their claws and teeth brutally shredding and tearing. Blood sprayed across the snow-covered floor of the cabin. Our screams faded into the night along with the evil, resounding howls. In the morning, the storm had passed. A search party made its way cautiously to the ravaged cabin after seeing smoke still rising from its chimney. Inside, they found no trace of my family. Only bloody claw marks and massive canine-like prints stained the snow. Old Man Jennings was cowering under an overturned table, his mind permanently shattered. The glowing eyes, the howls he babbled incoherently before dissolving into deranged laughter. From that night on, the townsfolk whispered rumors that on cold, stormy nights, a pack of hulking, nightmarish beasts with burning red eyes still roams the dark woods. They say you can hear their bone-chilling wails carried on the wind. No one dared to search for my family or explore where the creatures may have come from. Fear and dread seems to linger over that remote stretch of woods. Once in a while, a lonely howl will sound in the night, or glowing eyes will peer from the darkness as the unwary pass by. The winter wind howled outside the old farmhouse. Inside, the fire crackled as Emma pulled her quilt tighter around her shoulders. This was her first winter alone on the farm since her father died last spring. The isolation of the long winter months always made Emma uneasy, but this year it felt different, more ominous. As night fell and darkness blanketed the countryside, strange sounds echoed outside, creaks and scratches from unseen animals hunting in the cold. The wind whistled through the bare trees, sounding almost like voices whispering. Emma double-checked the front door, making sure it was securely locked and bolted. Then she checked the back door and all the first-floor windows. She knew she was alone, yet couldn't escape the creeping sensation that she was being watched from the darkness outside. As Emma climbed the stairs to her bedroom, a loud thump from above made her gasp. She paused on the steps, straining to hear any other sounds. Silence. Just the usual creaks and groans of the old house settling, she told herself, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach remained. Safely under the covers in her bed, Emma tried to sleep, but a scratching sound from inside her bedroom wall made her skin crawl. Small animals sometimes got into the walls. She knew that. But this felt different. The scratching continued, methodical and rhythmic, as if something was deliberately scraping its nails along the inside of the walls, trying to get out. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blankets over her head to block out the sound. She begged for sleep to take her, so this fearful night would end. But each time she drifted off, a noise would jerk her awake again. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above her head. Back and forth, they paced, from one side of the attic to the other. But that made no sense. No one could be up there. Then Emma heard the shuffling footsteps descend the attic stairs, approaching the second-floor hallway. Terror gripped her. Someone was in the house. The footsteps crept right up to her bedroom door. Floorboards creaked under an unseen weight. Emma held her breath, paralyzed in fear. A faint scratching sounded as something slid slowly down the other side of her door, as if fingernails were clawing their way toward her. Cold panic flooded through Emma's veins. She wanted desperately to leap up and barricade her door, but the terror of what might lie on the other side kept her frozen in place. The scratching continued as the slow scraping moved ominously around the doorframe. It sounded as if someone or something was methodically encircling her room, trapping her inside. Then, silence. The scratching stopped. Emma's wildly pounding heart deafened her, as she strained to hear any sound over her own panicked gasps. Seconds stretched out, feeling like hours. Emma knew there was no escape. She pulled the covers over her head like a terrified child, willing morning light to come. Suddenly, the floorboards outside her room creaked loudly as if under a heavy weight. Something was out there, and it was coming for her. Emma squeezed her eyes shut and held perfectly still, as though not seeing or hearing it would make it not real. She prayed silently, feeling tears stream down her cheeks into her pillow. The sounds slowly faded as dawn's light brightened her window. As soon as pale gold touched the glass, Emma leapt from her bed, threw open the door, and turned on every light. She raced down to the kitchen and grabbed a large knife from the drawer, clutching it tight in her shaking hand. But in the calm morning stillness, nothing looked disturbed. No footprints or signs of an intruder tracked through the dust on the creaky floors. No scratches marred the painted woodwork by her door. Everything was still and quiet. Emma's heart still raced as she searched every corner of the house, finding nothing unusual. After rechecking doors and windows were still secured, Emma allowed herself to take slow, deep breaths. Safe in the warm light of day, Emma started to wonder if it had all been in her imagination. A trick of the wind and dark playing on her fears of being alone through the dismal winter. Setting down the knife, Emma shook her head and laughed weakly at herself. She turned back to the door, just as a loud scratch ripped through the silence. Emma cried out in terror, whirling around to see jagged grooves appear on the door before her eyes. Frantic pounding footsteps charged down the hole from the direction of the attic. The ceiling above Emma's head shook with the sound as a blood-curdling scream rang out. Spinning wildly, Emma saw nothing, but she could feel whatever was tormenting her lurking just out of sight. A loud crash came from the kitchen. Emma ran toward the doorway and froze. On the floor lay the shattered remains of the stove door glass. Jagged shards were strewn across the worn planks, and no one was there. Here's a 15,000 character, long, scary winter story I wrote. The snow was falling heavy as I walked through the small mountain town. I pulled my coat tightly around me, trying to keep the bitter wind out. I had just arrived earlier that day on the train, planning to spend a quiet winter holiday alone in the remote village. I had rented a small cabin just on the outskirts of town, surrounded by snow-covered pine trees. As night fell, the wind began to howl through the trees. I made myself a warm meal and settled in next to the fire with a book. A few hours later, a loud banging on the door jolted me awake. I hadn't even realized I had dozed off. Who could possibly be out in this weather at this hour? I opened the door to find a woman standing there, covered head to toe in thick snow as the wind whipped wildly behind her. "Please, let me in," she yelled over the wind. "My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been walking for hours in the storm." I hurried her inside and checked her for signs of hypothermia and frostbite. Other than being very cold, she seemed all right. "What on earth were you doing out driving in this weather?" I asked as I wrapped a blanket around her. "I was trying to make it to the next town over when my car died. I knew there were some cabins out this way. Yours was the first I came across. Thank God you were here, or who knows if I would have survived out there." I made hot tea and we sat by the fire. She was quite shaken up as she recounted her terrifying ordeal being lost in the blizzard. I let her stay the night until the storm passed enough for her to safely get help in the morning. I set her up the small extra bedroom, and soon we both drifted off, exhausted from the dramatic events. A few hours later, I was startled awake again, this time by a blood-curdling scream from inside the cabin. I leapt up from bed and ran into the other room. In the darkness, I could just make out the woman sitting straight up in bed, screaming at the top of her lungs. "What's wrong?" I cried out, but she did not respond, just kept screaming, staring wide-eyed around the room. I turned the light on to see her face frozen in a look of complete terror as an endless scream emanated from deep within her. Her gaze seemed fixed at something at the foot of the bed that I could not see. "What do you see?" I shouted, trying to break her from the trance as her wailing pierced my ears. But no matter what I did, she would not stop screaming. Finally, I dragged her from her bed and into the living room, closing the door tight behind us. Her screams turned into panicked gibberish as she sputtered on about something evil lurking in that room. I tried to calm her, but she was hysterical, crying that we were not safe here with that thing inside. I let her ramble as her experience clearly had traumatized her sanity. Once she settled a bit, I went to search the bedroom, expecting to confirm it was nothing but her overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion and fear. But as I opened the door, a sudden drop in temperature washed over me, far colder than the rest of the cabin. I slowly swept my light around the small room, looking for anything abnormal. Then, in far corner, The shadowy form of a human shape seemed to shift ever so slightly. I slammed the door and rushed back to the woman, insisting now more than ever that we needed to get into town and get help. She readily agreed, terrified to remain in the cabin another moment. We gathered our things and headed out into the darkness, trudging through knee-deep snow towards the distant lights.